It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the MSI MAG 321 CUP. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and also by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. You can find a link to additional content and information about how you can support the work that we do in the description of the video. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. This monitor has a 31.5-inch Optronics VA panel. It has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution, and a 160Hz refresh rate is supported. You'll also notice from the video that the screen has a curve to it. This is a 1500R moderate curve, and I have to say that in videos and photos of the monitor there's a strange pincushion effect. You don't actually observe it like that at all to the eye. It's more natural and it's something you should adapt to over time. I've been using this monitor for a couple of weeks now and I'm really very used to the curve. It's not something which I actively notice too much. It just kind of draws you in a little bit when you're using the monitor, and it can be nice for entertainment purposes. Personally, when it comes to 32-inch or so screens, 16:9 like this one, I can sort of take or leave the curve when it's like this. It's not super steep, it's not super annoying, but at the same time it doesn't dramatically change the experience. So onto the resolution. I'm happy to use this 4K UHD resolution without any scaling. You might want to use some scaling, and if you do, just be aware that the excellent pixel density which you get here, it still applies. So as long as your application is scaling cleanly, and most do, or you're using application-specific zoom, then the text is larger, but you still benefit from the nice tight pixel density in terms of the clarity. So yeah, the detail and clarity is very good. There's a very slight softening to the text because of the subpixels, and I'll come on to this shortly, but I do stress the very slight. I don't think most people are actually going to notice this at all, to be honest, and they'll just appreciate the overall sharp look and the clarity and the detail, and you also get that for suitably high resolution image content. That would include games as well. And of course, just the general level of desktop real estate if you're multitasking is excellent. Moving on now to the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some related features. The monitor has an OC mode which you can use via DisplayPort, only via DisplayPort, and this unlocks a 160Hz refresh rate. Otherwise you'll be limited to 144Hz. The image here shows the monitor hooked up via DisplayPort and that OC mode is enabled, so we've got 160Hz at the 3840 by 2160 resolution, and it supports a 10-bit signal at the same time. You can use HDR at the same time as well, and adaptive sync. You can use VRR technologies such as AMD FreeSync Premium and Nvidia G-Sync compatible. Something to be aware of, if you are using the OC mode of the monitor, that unlocks DSC capability, and that means that if you're using that, then there'll be the usual DSC restrictions such as certain Nvidia features like DSR and DLDSR not being available. So if you want to use those features, just keep the OC mode off. And again, you're going to be limited to 144Hz maximum. And that applies either way when you're using HDMI. So this is HDMI 2.1 here. There's no OC mode for HDMI, so 144Hz maximum, although you can use those Nvidia features and there aren't DSC restrictions. And you get HDR support, adaptive sync at the same time. You also get HDMI 2.1 VRR, which the PS5 can use even though it can't use adaptive sync. It also means you can use Nvidia G-Sync compatible via HDMI as well. So basically you've got all of your VRR options, and it supports up to 10 bits per channel at 144Hz. If you lower the refresh rate to 120Hz or below via HDMI, then there will also be a 12-bit option if you want to use that. For most people, there's no advantage to using that. There's a very slim amount of content that can actually use 12 bits per channel, but if you happen to be using some or you want to be using that, just be aware, 120Hz or below via HDMI for that. And there are some additional refresh rates supported via HDMI listed here. Note there isn't a 24Hz mode. And for those interested, these HDMI 2.1 ports, they are full bandwidth 48 gigabits per second ports. So it's interesting that they didn't include an OC mode. For whatever reason, they've decided that's a DisplayPort only feature on this model. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to have a quick look at the scaling capability of the monitor. So at the moment I'm running at the native 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution. I'm going to switch over to the QHD resolution. It has to be at 144Hz maximum to actually use scaling on the monitor. You can use GPU scaling at 160Hz, by the way, and it's fairly similar to what the monitor does, but I just want to stick to what the monitor's doing here. And with this, there's a little bit of softening, but it's actually not too bad. So it does look a bit softer than a native QHD model of this size, but not massively so. There is a sharpness control in image, that's the main sharpness control of the monitor. If you increase this perhaps as high as 2, I find this gives a good edge and sharpness without strong over sharpening, so quite a good representation, I'd say, overall. In professional, there's also image enhancement, which is an alternative sharpness filter. Even set to weak, I find that over sharpens some things, but some people might prefer how this looks, so you can use one or both of these settings. It's entirely up to you. I've just disabled both of them for now. Moving on to the full HD resolution now. And again, you need to select 144 Hz maximum to use scaling on the monitor. You can always use GPU scaling instead. So with this, the softening is more noticeable now. It doesn't really look as it should. Obviously, a screen of this size, native full HD, is a horrible pixel density, so it's never going to look amazing, but it still doesn't have the sort of slightly soft focus appearance you get here. But again, increasing the sharpness perhaps as high as 2, I think that offsets it quite nicely, and the overall representation's better now. And you could use the image enhancement if you prefer, or you could use both. So again, good flexibility and overall a good interpolation process on this monitor. And just to quickly mention, there are some screen size settings if you want to change or enforce a different aspect ratio. So auto should look at the source resolution and adjust according to that, but you can enforce various different aspect ratios, including 1:1, which is a pixel mapping feature. So if you select 1:1, it should only use the pixels called for by the source resolution. And the rest of the pixels should be a black border. The reason I had to do that twice is that you have to disable adaptive sync if you use the screen size setting, and it's just done that for me. The first time it just disabled adaptive sync and then set it back to auto, so you have to make sure adaptive sync's disabled or it'll just do it for you eventually. So this is a full HD resolution with 1:1 pixel mapping and the QHD resolution with 1:1 pixel mapping. Although I haven't specifically measured the latency with this setting, it's actually very time consuming to measure latency in the way that I do, so I don't tend to do it with many conditions, but I can just say that the felt latency is rather on the high side with this 1:1 setting. You can use GPU scaling instead, and that's usually low latency. So you might want to just use GPU scaling instead, just in general if you want to be using 1:1. Of course, with a games console, you have to be using what the monitor offers. From the front, you can see the stand design. That is coated metal, so it gives it a fairly nice, quite premium, fairly solid feel to the stand base at least. And the overall monitor as well, I would say it has a reasonably solid feel to it. Not super premium, but certainly not cheap feeling either. Not a huge amount of wobble or anything like that. Reasonably solid. You also get good ergonomic flexibility with the stand, so you can adjust the height by 130mm or 5.12 inches. You can tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit, and you can swivel it left and right. So in terms of the height adjustment, that's with it at the lowest height, so it's not particularly close to the desk, not super close to the desk. And at its highest height, it's pretty high up. And as for the depth of the monitor and the stand, it's 267mm or 10.51 inches. So it's not the most compact design out there, but actually for a monitor of this kind of size, it's not a massive desk depth hog either. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so there's a thin panel border flush with the rest of the screen. You can just about see it when it's switched off as it is now. It does blend in quite well though. It's clearer when the screen is switched on, as I'll show you elsewhere in the review. And there's a thin, hard outer plastic component to the bezel as well. The screen's curved, as I mentioned earlier. The screen surface is what I'd classify as a light matte anti-glare finish. So that means it offers reasonable glare handling, but not super strong, not as strong as some matte screen surfaces, although stronger than very light matte screen surfaces. And that means that you do sometimes get some sharper glare patches as well, with a slightly glassy appearance in places, depending on your lighting. But you don't get that as much as with very light matte anti-glare screen surfaces, and certainly you don't get the kind of mirror-like reflections you can get on glossy screen surfaces. And also with the curve of the screen, it means if you're viewing it off angle, it does tend to catch a lot of light and give you some stretched glare patches which go across the screen. So it is something to be cautious of if you're viewing the screen off angle in a bright room. At the rear, there's a mixture of matte and glossy dark plastics, and actually various different matte textures. There's sort of a brush texture there as well, and the same for the rear of the stand. Also notice there's a little cable tidy loop at the bottom of the stand there, little cable management system. The OSD control joystick there, This monitor does actually have a dedicated power button. That caught me out when I first started using it, because sometimes you just press the joystick to power the monitor on. In this case, there's actually a dedicated power button at the bottom there. The stand attaches via 100 by 100mm VESA, and you can remove that and use an alternative compatible mount if you prefer. There's a case lock there, and of course the ports, so they face backwards in a little recessed area. You've got two HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4, you've got USB-C with 15 watts of power delivery, and DisplayPort Alt mode. You have a 3.5mm headphone jack, and you've got a DC power input, so the monitor has an external power brick. This model doesn't include any integrated speakers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about interlace pattern artifacts. So on this model, I observed both static and dynamic interlace pattern artifacts. Many of you might not know what I'm talking about here, but I will give you some examples. I mean, there's an example of how this appears in terms of the static interlace patterns on the screen now. So these are observed as horizontal lines on various shades, including some blues, orange, and even grey shades and whites. Sometimes they appear to break up into a slightly darker and lighter variant of the shade with horizontal lines. And these weren't noticeable at lower refresh rates in the double digits, but I did find them more obvious as the refresh rate increased. I found them reasonably noticeable in places at 120Hz, but clearer at 144Hz, and clearer again at 160Hz. So in this example here in the image, you can see that at 60Hz, there's just a nice even mesh of subpixels, and to the eye that just appears like a nice solid blue shade, as you'd expect. Whereas at 160Hz, you've got those horizontal lines of a darker and lighter variant of the shade, and to the eye you can observe these lines. They're not super obvious even at 160Hz, but it's something which I notice, and sensitive users are certainly able to notice these in places. The monitor also suffered from dynamic interlace patterns. Some people might refer to these as scan lines or pixel inversion artifacts. They have various different names, but I prefer dynamic interlace pattern artifacts. It's more descriptive. So when I was scanning my eyes across the screen horizontally and viewing certain shades, generally lighter greys and blues, so there's a blue example here where it was observed, I can sometimes see vertical wavy lines, and you can see them captured here. Obviously this is a static photograph. I tried to actually get a little video clip of this, but I couldn't capture it properly. But I was actually able to capture it with a waving camera, so a moving camera, like a pursuit photograph style wave of the camera. Just remember, these are dynamic in nature, so they sort of come and go as you move your eyes. And they're fairly broadly spaced. It's basically like a kind of interference pattern, that's how I'd describe it. And these appear in a pretty much inverse way to the static interlace patterns. So by 60Hz, there was this obvious wavy pattern. It's actually at 60Hz where I captured this image here when I was observing movement and certain content was displayed, or simply by scanning the eyes at times across the screen. I'd say they were somewhat noticeable up to around 100Hz. They were faint by 120Hz, and certainly beyond that. I mean, most of the time I was using the monitor at triple-digit refresh rates. Most of the time on the desktop, for example, I'd be at 160Hz, and I really very rarely noticed this. I think for most people, if you're sensitive to this kind of thing, possibly an issue at 60Hz or below 80Hz, but above that, I generally think most people aren't going to notice them. And I should also mention that in both cases, they apply in a similar way if you're talking about a static refresh rate or a refresh rate achieved under VRR. Taking a look now at the subpixels of the monitor uses a normal RGB striped subpixel layout without partial subpixel illumination or split subpixels or other odd subpixel related issues. So this is all standard as expected by Windows, and you don't need to run through the ClearType wizard and make changes, but you may wish to do so and adjust according to your own preferences anyway. There is a slight issue with the subpixels in that they're a bit squat with relatively large gaps above and below each subpixel. Because of the relatively high pixel density, these gaps are still tiny and they don't cause any major issues. Text did appear just slightly softer than I'd expect from a monitor with this pixel density, though I stress the slightly here. So adjusting ClearType didn't really change this. It could be offset to a degree by increasing the sharpness level in the OSD, but I found some elements slightly over sharpened, even with increasing this just 1 point from 0 to 1. So I just left it at 0 for a more neutral appearance. Some people may prefer increasing it beyond 0, but it's fair to say that I think most people, just using this monitor generally, they're going to find the default setting of 0 just fine in terms of text representation. So I stress again, this is a minor issue, a minor complaint. Moving on to the calibration now. The monitor was tested with various different settings here, and I recorded the gamma, the central average gamma, using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which is now marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus, and I measured the white point using a Spider X Elite colorimeter. So you can see with all conditions tested, gamma ran a bit below the 2.2 target. It was between 2.0 and 2.1 basically, and the white point out of the box, a little bit on the cool side, but not too bad, at 6745K. I also like to look at the low blue light settings of the monitor just to show you the kind of effect they have on the color temperature. Some people do like to use these in the evenings for a generally more relaxing viewing experience. And the main low blue light setting, that had a noticeable green or greenish yellow tint to the image, which I find visually unpleasant, and I know some other people do as well. The alternative would be to set color temperature to warm, and using the factory defaults but with color temperature set to warm, I got 5171K, so slightly lower white point. It's a very effective low blue light setting, but the tint to the image is amber, which I find easier to adjust to and generally more relaxing than the greenish yellow tint. For my test settings, you can see how I set the monitor up. There's also a best settings video which runs through this in a little bit more detail if you're interested. But basically what I did is I used the user mode, turned on adaptive sync, response time was set to fast, reduced the brightness to 30, made some adjustments to the color channels with color temperature set to customization to allow me to do that. DP overclocking was set to on, so I got the 160 Hz refresh rate. And as noted there, individual units and preferences vary. These won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but I've included some in the video description if you wish to try them out. One was created using the test settings and the other using Pro Mode sRGB with all the defaults for that. And by the way, I didn't mention earlier, Pro Mode sRGB, that's an sRGB emulation setting. I did cover it in the table though. I got a white point of exactly 6000K on my unit, so a bit on the warm side, and you can't adjust the color channels using the sRGB setting, so that's something to be aware of. I'm going to explore gamma in a little bit more detail now. So this graph here shows the gamma recorded under my test settings. It was very similar out of the box, incidentally, with the defaults for the user setting. So you can see the x-axis there shows the grey level. So the higher number there is a lighter shade, closer to white, and a lower value is closer to black. The lowest gamma recorded was a little bit below 2.0, and that was for some of the bright shades. And for the darkest shades, it was a little bit above 2.0, close to that average I recorded, which was 2.05. So what that means is that there is an uplift of detail for darker shades, a little bit of extra unintended detail, and ideally the gamma would have been closer to 2.2, but the monitor doesn't have alternative gamma settings which would correct this properly. So in general, shades are just a bit brighter than they should be. So it's not a massive issue. I mean, it's not a super low gamma or anything, but it is still a little bit lower than I'd like to see. This graph here shows the sRGB setting. So although the average gamma is quite similar, it's 2.07 now, there's more variability, as you can see in the graph. So looking at those dark shades at the start of the graph first, there is reduced gamma here, and that includes those below 5% grey, incidentally, which aren't shown in this graph. It wasn't extreme enough to bring this towards tracking the sRGB gamma curve, but still, you've got some below 1.9 gamma, so it's certainly a bit on the low side. So there wasn't the sort of clear uplift or strong uplift of dark detail which you'd see if it was tracking the sRGB gamma curve, but still more than you'd see with proper 2.2 gamma tracking. And as for the bright shades, you can actually see the gamma rising all the way up to close to 2.3 for the brightest shades recorded here. So again, quite variable and not ideal gamma tracking here. Moving on now to the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor. So the table here shows various readings taken using the X-Rite colorimeter, or what would now be marketed as a Calibrite colorimeter. So the maximum brightness recorded was 383 nits, and that was using color temperature customization with everything set to their neutral position of 100. And I do go through in the test settings that the neutral position is actually 100, not 50 as it's set to by default on this monitor, or was on my unit for some reason. So that's reasonably bright, but not super bright. And the lowest value recorded was 74 nits, which is a bit brighter than some sensitive users would like to see. Most people, though, they're going to be setting their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits, so this monitor does accommodate that with a bit of room either side. What I found a bit disappointing, though, was the contrast ratio. Not disappointing if you look at monitors as a whole, because, you know, it's around 2000 to 1 a lot of the time. This is a VA model, and I have certainly seen contrast ratios which are double or more this on VA panels relatively recently, and it does sit below the 3000 to 1 specified. It could have been that my unit was just a little bit bad in that respect, so perhaps some units would be stronger and closer to 3000 to 1. But either way, I don't hold out too much hope that any units of this model are going to have super strong contrast. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so I can use some in-game examples to talk about contrast. I'm sitting in a dark room here. With this, I wouldn't say that the contrast experience is particularly strong. It does have a bit of an edge compared to your typical IPS model, and I can notice that. It is free from IPS glow, so there's not a strong glow from the corners of the screen. You can see some sort of patchiness at the top and bottom. That is partly clouding on this monitor, which my unit has, and it can vary between units, but in my experience, curved VA models often have a bit of this at the top and bottom edges, and that does certainly affect the atmosphere a bit. But even for more central regions, I wouldn't say the depth of the dark shades is particularly deep and inky. Again, better than most IPS models, but it's not a massive difference. And certainly comparing some IPS models which reach around 1500 to 1, there's not exactly a huge edge here. And again, there's the lack of IPS glow, which is helpful. But again, there's the clouding, and also VA glow is a thing, and the clouding can bring that out more strongly. If you're sitting close to the screen or you're using a higher brightness level, then you might notice more of this VA glow as well. It's more subtle than IPS glow, but it does give a bit of a brightening up towards the peripheral regions of the screen. And when I look at the medium shades and somewhat brighter shades as well, I think they're represented reasonably well. I mean, certainly a better performance there than more solid and inky appearance than on some models, but again, not super strong in this respect. And I've used quite a few OLEDs recently, which do spoil me a bit in this respect, and they are super strong there compared to any VA model, and certainly this one. So really it's about having a bit of an edge compared to your average IPS, but still it would have been nicer to see a stronger performance here given that this is a VA panel. As I mentioned in the calibration section as well, the gamma is a bit on the low side, which means that there's extra unintended dark detail. And that is actually, the perceived gamma is increased further peripherally because of the fact it has a VA panel, and there's some shifts in gamma comparing the central region to the peripheral regions of the screen. That means it does have quite a bit of an uplift towards the edges of the screen. Some people might quite like that for game content. It sort of makes things more visible, but it can also give a little bit of a flooded or uplifted look in places just for that reason. It's not too bad, as I said. It's not like the sRGB gamma curve where there's a really strong uplift and it doesn't have super low gamma there, but it's just something to be aware of. And also it means that if you're watching heavily compressed streamed content, you might notice compression artifacts and little artifacts which should be more blended than they will appear on this monitor, just because of the gamma being a bit lower than it should be. And the shift comparing the central region to the peripheral regions of the screen, it isn't as pronounced as some VA models. The curve does help with that, and the panel itself has fairly strong viewing angle performance, as I'll explore shortly, for the panel type at least, so it's not really too bad. It's just something which I do think is worth mentioning. When I observe the lighter shades, again there's that light matte anti-glare screen surface, so there isn't an obvious layering in front of the image or anything like that. There's not a strong smeary graininess either. There's a bit of what I would describe as a light misty graininess. So it isn't the smoothest screen surface I've seen, but it certainly isn't the grainiest either. For most people, I know I'm very sensitive to this, but for most people, I think the level of graininess is going to be just fine in this case. But of course, not everyone sits in a dark room, and although a lot of what I've said will apply in a brighter room, certainly with the lighter shades and the medium shades and all of that, the dark shade representation in particular will certainly change if the room is lightened up a bit, as it is now. So it just draws your eyes away from those weaknesses, the less than incredible static contrast ratios, less noticeable, the clouding issues, and the slight VA glow I was talking about. They just don't stand out in the same way. But you might notice that there is some glare on the screen. With the light matte anti-glare screen surface, it does tend to diffuse that glare a little bit, but there can be some sharper glare patches. And as I mentioned with the features and aesthetics section, if you're viewing the monitor off angle, then the glare can be stretched out and become super noticeable. But in general, it still offers decent glare handling. There aren't any super sharp reflections, nothing like some glossy screens would show. And even some lighter matte screen surfaces can show this more readily than I observe here. But it is worth saying as well that it's not just for the dark shades that the ambient light competing with the image will affect. It will affect the brighter shades and the medium shades as well. It gives a kind of hazy effect, that's how I'd describe it. And this hazing is stronger than on some matte screen surfaces and also glossy screen surfaces, but it isn't as strong as it is on strong matte screen surfaces, so heavy matte screen surfaces, whatever you want to call them, or heavier. Even medium matte screen surfaces are heavier than this one. They will diffuse light more aggressively. So basically they will haze up the image more than I'm seeing here, although it is certainly still occurring here to an extent. And I've brightened the room up even more just to show you that, if you're sitting in a particularly bright room, then you can get glare issues, and that hazing can be pretty strong in places. I'm on legom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles. I'm going to talk about colour reproduction, but I'd like to start off by looking at colour consistency. So this describes changes in a given shade as it would be represented in the central regions of the screen versus peripherally or anywhere else on the screen, really. So the Legom text test, ideally this would appear a blended grey throughout the screen. There wouldn't be any distinct colours to the striping of the text. Here it appears with a noticeable reddish tint for most of the screen. It's really for a large central cone in the middle of the screen where it's particularly red, and then it does fade out and become brighter in appearance towards the peripheral regions of the screen. But this cone, on some VA models, it's really tight and there's a super obvious shift, very sudden shift from center to just to beyond center. But here it's really most of the screen appears fairly consistent red, and then it just transitions a bit more gradually towards the brighter appearance. So what this all means is that the monitor does have moderate viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve, but it isn't as bad as some VA models in this respect. Perhaps more relatable would be to consider solid colours. So the purple block here, it as often appears odd on the camera, sort of patchy in weird ways, but to the eye this appears a solid, slightly pinkish purple throughout the screen. It does appear more pink peripherally, and if you're sitting closer to the screen, by the way, these shifts are a bit more exaggerated. I tend to sit with my eyes around 70 centimeters from the screen, so when I'm talking about the shifts here, that's really what I'm considering. So it is a bit pinker towards the edges of the screen compared to the central region, but again, not the extreme shift you'd see on some VA models. And the pink hue does shift alongside head movement. The red block, that appears a fairly rich red for the most part, but it does transitions to more of a sort of burnt appearance, more faded red peripherally. And again, that would shift if you move your head or move your eyes, your viewing position. The green block, that appears a yellowish green chartreuse throughout the screen, slightly less saturated towards the peripheral regions of the screen than centrally. The blue block appears a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. Though this monitor's colour gamut, it's quite generous but not extremely generous, and if you have a colour gamut on the monitor and you're using a colour gamut on the monitor which extends beyond sRGB, when you're observing content like this, which is a game running an SDR, or you're just on the desktop observing general content, or you're watching movies and you're not using colour management, then things are going to be designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and you're going to get extra saturation and extra vibrancy using a gamut on the monitor which extends beyond that. So the gamut of this monitor natively and under my test settings, I recorded 90% DCI-P3 coverage, and for those interested, 86% Adobe RGB coverage. So there's a lot of extension beyond sRGB, although it doesn't extend to fully cover DCI-P3 and certainly not Adobe RGB. So with this game, for example, there's some certain extra pop to these blue shades for the containers here, and the sky blue has a bit of extra pop as well. It doesn't look as cartoonish, sort of as really over vibrant as I've seen on some models, certainly doesn't. But there is an extra bit of pop, extra bit of vibrancy, same for the orange painted crane there as well. Fires and explosions look pretty lively as well. And actually red shades on this monitor in general tend to look pretty vibrant. The cones as well look more of a sort of reddish orange than they should. Pretty eye-catching. If you want to tone things down, you want more of the as intended look to things within the sRGB colour space, then you could switch over to the sRGB emulation setting. So the Pro Mode sRGB setting. With this active, incidentally, you can adjust the brightness, but you can't adjust the contrast, you can't adjust the colour temperature, so you can't adjust those colour channels either. And there isn't a gamma setting on this monitor, so you can't adjust that. But now things are toned down. So the cones, for example, they look more of an orange shade. The sky blues look more neutral. And I'd say that the earthy brown colours as well, I was mentioning about the rich reds, and sometimes they have a bit too much pop to them. You can see that with skin tones, for example, they look a little bit overdone in places, and certain earthy brown shades and woody browns look a bit overdone, and these are toned down with the sRGB setting. Although, if you remember, I did talk a little bit about colour consistency earlier, using Lagom examples, and that does apply here. So actually, I'd say that there's a bit of undersaturation peripherally for some of these shades. It's more noticeable with the sRGB setting, whereas using the full native gamut of the monitor, you might notice quite a bit of oversaturation for most of the screen, but actually peripherally it'll look a little bit more like it should. And again, this shift comparing the central region to the peripheral regions, it's not extreme for a VA model by any means. It's just less consistent than you get on IPS and certainly on OLED monitors. And with these shifts in mind and actually the colour gamut performance, I don't generally recommend this monitor for colour critical work or colour accurate work, although you can use it if you need to, and it's sort of not your primary use, or you don't need super accurate colour reproduction, just because of the consistency issues and also the fact you're getting 90% DCI-P3 coverage and 86% Adobe RGB coverage. You're not going to be getting accurate reproduction within those wide colour spaces anyway. But with sRGB in mind, yeah, you get 100% full sRGB coverage natively. And using the setting I'm using at the moment, the sRGB setting, the gamut looks like this, by the way. So there's 98% sRGB coverage, but there's not a lot of extension beyond sRGB. It's clamping the gamut very effectively closer to sRGB. So I'll switch back over to my test settings, and something to be aware of as well. If you want an sRGB gamut clamp, you want sRGB emulation, you don't want to restrict your colour channels and other controls on the monitor, you could stick to the user setting or my test settings and then use a GPU level alternative. They are explored on the website in an article all about sRGB emulation. There's an accompanying video on the channel as well. But an alternative way which you can use with Windows 11 now is to use Windows ACM, Auto Color Management. And actually, on some systems that seems to be enabled by default. It was a feature which was added to the H224 update to Windows 11, and it sometimes seems to be enabled by default. So if you're not aware of this, it will actually be undersaturating your image or reducing the saturation using native settings, and then if you try and use the sRGB setting on top on the monitor, it's going to cause significant undersaturation. Anyway, there's a video exploring all of this, and I've linked to that in the video description. I would just like to talk briefly about off-angle performance, viewing angle performance. So this monitor doesn't lose its contrast as sharply or as quickly as some VA models when you go off-angle. It does still lose quite a bit of its punch, or its punchiness. From the sides and above. As usual for VA, if you view from below, so say you're below the monitor on a couch or something, then actually it sort of gains depth and punchiness because the perceived gamma is increased. So what I would say is that if you've got friends over or whatever and they're sort of to the side of you a bit, then they're still going to get an okay representation of the image. Not as stable as you'd get on an IPS model, certainly not OLED, but it's not as bad as some VA models, so it can be quite accommodating for that. But also the curve of the screen, it can make it look a little bit weird when you're off angle as well, just for that reason. If you're sitting below the monitor, for example, that can work pretty well, I'd say, as long as the angle isn't too extreme. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider running a game under HDR, and this is not going to be a very long section because this monitor has very basic HDR support. It is VESA Display HDR 400 certified, the lowest level which VESA will certify for. Very basic HDR 10 output on this monitor. Under HDR, there's no local dimming and there's no dynamic contrast used either, so the backlight just stays at a high level regardless of what's going on the scene. I recorded 446 nits for the white luminance under HDR, so that's higher than the maximum I measured under SDR, which was 383 nits. So 446 nits, reasonable brightness, but certainly not particularly impressive by HDR standards. And I measured 2100:1 for the contrast ratio, which is really on the upper end of what I recorded under SDR, but really nothing spectacular, certainly not for an HDR performance. I also recorded a colour temperature of around 6350 Kelvin, with decent green channel balance as well. And actually all of these things that I've just mentioned there, they were similar with both the user and the movie preset. As I mentioned in the best settings video, I prefer the movie preset, or I did on my model, because saturation levels were better. It was really quite undersaturated with the user setting, and with the movie setting that is improved. But really on the contrast side, it's pretty disappointing under HDR. So you've got that high backlight brightness level. Any clouding you have on the monitor becomes pretty obvious. VA glow becomes obvious. You'll see that towards the top of the screen and the bottom for that matter. There isn't the appropriate depth and inkiness to the shadow details, little cracks in the rocks, that kind of thing. Even the medium shades are brighter than they should be. Or not as inky as they should be. And the brightness isn't exactly exceptional, comparing the brightness out there to the darker shades inside. So it just doesn't give you the appropriate dynamic experience you should get under HDR. Jumping into the water, the scene here doesn't look spectacular either, so the brightness of the water glint's reasonable, but again, you've got under 450 nits there, so nothing to write home about. The medium shades are represented in an alright way, I guess that's the best I could say there. Again, the contrast isn't particularly impressive and there's no local dimming going on, so the dimming precision's poor. It also means that, yes, you get 10-bit color processing, so you get smoother gradients to the weather effects and the mist on the water, that kind of thing. And the gamut can be mapped more appropriately, which is nice, but to really make use of that 10-bit color reproduction, you'd have a really lovely nuanced variety of dark shades, which you don't get here because of the contrast and lack of dimming precision. And for the bright shades as well, there'd be much more variety than there is here. So speaking of color reproduction, with my preferred setting, movie, there's a bit of oversaturation, but it's toned down compared to under SDR. And again, I prefer this, as I mentioned in the best settings video, to the alternative user setting, which really just floods things and makes things clearly undersaturated. I'll just quickly switch over to that, just to see if you can have a little comparison, a little visual comparison in the video with the user setting here and my preferred movie setting. So Laura's skin, for example, under SDR, that's pretty overly tanned, too much pop to it, and that does exist to a degree here, but it is toned down. And there's a bit of a coppery tint, but too much of a coppery tint to the rocks there, for example. Again, a bit stronger under SDR, same with the greens, bit overdone, but not as much as under SDR. So overall, really quite a limited HDR experience. It does give a different look to things, and some people might like to use it just for a bit of extra variety, but this isn't something I'd buy the monitor for. I'm now going to explore the responsiveness of the monitor. I'm going to jump straight into some pursuit photographs at 160Hz, which is the maximum refresh rate that the monitor supports. If you don't know what pursuit photographs are and you want more background reading when it comes to responsiveness, please check out the article about responsiveness on the website. But what you can see here, so there are 3 different overdrive settings on this monitor: normal, fast and fastest. I would consider fast optimal, but even with that, the experience isn't exactly fantastic. If you compare it to the reference screen, which is an AOC Q27G3XMN, running at 180Hz, although the extra refresh rate doesn't really make much of a difference. It just means that the pixel response requirements for good performance are increased slightly, so it's actually a little bit harder for the AOC to perform well here. But even so, I'd say it generally performs slightly better than the MSI. So the MSI has a longer trail behind the object, so more sort of smeary trailing, if you like, behind the object. You can see that for the top row, it extends quite a bit further than that does on the AOC, although it's pretty bold on the AOC still. And for the medium background, there's just more of a trail behind it. For the bright background, the reference and the MSI do pretty well. If you look at the fastest setting on the MSI, it doesn't look like there's a lot of overshoot, but actually for some transitions not shown here, I did find it pretty noticeable, pretty eye-catching. Some obvious bright halo trailing, which was much brighter than the background and really stood out. And also some dirty trailing, which is a lot darker than the background. Quite a bit of that in places as well. So although it might look like fastest is the best to use here, and some people might like to use it depending on the overshoot sensitivity, I found fast the best balanced. And it does at least offer some improvement compared to the normal setting in terms of the reduction in conventional trailing. I know some of you prefer figures, so here are some figures. These were taken with the OSRT Pro tool, the same tool and methodology used by TFT Central. Just be careful when you cross-compare with other reviewer results because different methodologies, different equipment can be used. They also use their own color coding system, incidentally. But anyway, you can see here with the monitor using its normal response time setting, a weak performance, some really slow pixel transitions, a lot of red on the graph. The average initial time, so the initial time being what's measured in the first graph there, the average initial time is 13.68 milliseconds, so really not very good for 160 Hz, but very little in the way of overshoot. Bumping up now to the fast setting, it does improve things somewhat, but there's still quite a lot of red on the graph and some noticeably slow pixel responses. The average initial time has dropped significantly to 7.73 milliseconds, so that is a good improvement, but still not fantastic. There isn't very much in the way of overshoot, it's a little bit introduced in places. The fastest setting, that has dropped the initial time from 7.73 to 6.83 milliseconds, so a bit of a drop, but nothing dramatic, still some weaknesses shown, and you get quite a lot more overshoot, which is why I don't like this setting. In my view, you are getting some distinct weaknesses still in terms of slower than optimal pixel responses, as well as a lot of overshoot. I'm on Battlefield 5. I've got the game running at 160 frames a second, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its 160 Hz refresh rate. So I've shown you the visual experience, and the pixel responses are not fantastic, but you still do benefit from the high refresh rate in terms of the reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement. Again, if you're not sure what I'm talking about here, refer to the responsiveness article. The other advantage of the high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it improves the connected feel. So that describes the fluidity and the connectedness you feel when you're interacting with your character on the game. That's also something where low input lag is important, and this monitor does offer quite low input lag. I measured 4.05 milliseconds. It also includes an element of pixel responsiveness, which, as I've demonstrated, isn't exactly fantastic on this monitor. So it indicates a relatively low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel. So yeah, I mean, when I compare the overall experience to some faster 160 Hz models, just that mask of perceived blur in places, extra mask of perceived blur because of the pixel responses, and particularly where there are darker shades involved in the transition, more noticeable trailing around the wall there, for example. And just the little details like the cracks in the rocks, it just doesn't have the level of clarity you would hope for from a 160 Hz experience there. Also for the very bright shades, so the white writing and icon there, for example, against the medium background, some distinct weaknesses there as well. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has a lot of high contrast transitions, so there are lots of very dark shades and bright shades intermingling. And this does highlight very readily the weaknesses in the pixel response performance. So really, it's highlighting a lot of the red response times I showed you on the graph. The makeshift roof here is a great example of that. Some smeary trailing. Now, it isn't as extreme or as extended and smoke-like in its appearance as on some VA models, but it's still not particularly impressive in that respect. You get the same around the tree there and the flag post. You'll probably be able to see this on the video even. A sort of inky look to the trailing. Get the same with the boats down there as well and the rocks. And you also get a little bit of overshoot, a bit of dark trailing around the light there. But really that's sort of the worst example of overshoot, which isn't really a bad thing because it's not super obvious and you might not have even been able to see it in the video for that matter. Overshoot isn't really a particular issue with the monitor set to its fast setting. I've just switched over to fastest, and yeah, I mean there's a lot of weaknesses in terms of the pixel responses. They remain in much the same way, but there is a bit of overshoot in places now, a bit of bright halo trailing, and that sort of dirty trailing is more noticeable around the light now. So in general, again, I just prefer the balance with fast. So I'm going to switch back over to that. And the weaknesses, they don't always appear as distinct smeary trailing. It can appear as a sort of flickering effect because during movement, some of the medium shades can darken up and blend more into their surroundings. And when the movement ceases, it returns to the appropriate brightness level. So with little movements, you can get kind of flickering in places like around the bush and the shadow details there. And that can be a bit distracting to some people. And if you're not gaming, I'm on X and I'm using the, I think it's called lights out mode, the darkest setting. So this again has lots of these high contrast transitions which the monitor struggles with. So even if you're on the desktop, you can notice these weaknesses. They're particularly noticeable if you were moving windows around. if you're scrolling in some applications, but it depends on the scrolling animations, and the animations in general on some applications can really show these weaknesses off in an obvious way, even on the desktop. On Chrome, with the scrolling behavior, when you're actually scrolling, it doesn't seem too bad because it scrolls a big section at once and it just sort of skips between different frames in a way, and that's okay. You don't get the weaknesses there. But if you move it around, or the application's using smoother animations for whatever reason, or in places, then you can notice the weaknesses. And if I look at the grey text there, for example, it blends in during movement, just like the flickering I was showing you with the bush and the shadow details. So it brightens up appropriately when the movement ceases, but then it blends in too much when it moves, again with that flickering effect. So not ideal. If you're using the, shall we say, more conventional dark text against a brighter background, then the weaknesses aren't so apparent. You're not really going to notice even when you're moving windows around or scrolling, because the pixel responses it's capturing here are a bit better. And if the application is using a colour scheme which is somewhere between these two extremes, like this is now, then yeah, you get some weaknesses. It's not as noticeable as it was with the lights out setting, but still some definite smeary trailing in places, some definite weaknesses, and just a general lack of clarity that you'd expect from 160 Hz. The monitor also offers VRR support, variable refresh rates. You can use AMD FreeSync Premium, you can use Nvidia G-Sync compatible, and you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR on the PS5, for example. On this monitor, you can use HDR and VRR at the same time if you wish, but as I noted earlier, HDR is not exactly great on this monitor, so you may not wish, or may wish to not. So at 120 Hz, as I'm running now, the smeary trailing, the weaknesses, they're still pretty apparent, not as apparent as at 160 Hz, but they're definitely still there, these distinct weaknesses. But the monitor does do its thing with VRR, so it keeps tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches at bay. The range of operation is 48 to 160 Hz. LFC, low frame rate compensation, is also used, so if it drops below 48 frames a second, 48 Hz, then it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. It isn't an exact cutoff as usual, it's not exactly 48 Hz. Sometimes I observed LFC kicking in a bit closer to 55 Hz on this model. That's something which I often observe, at least on the Nvidia side. There are some issues around the LFC boundary which I'll come back to, but for now I'm just going to still focus on this 120 Hz experience. And some physique photographs which really just reinforce what I was saying in terms of the smeary trailing still being there, but being somewhat reduced compared to 160 Hz. Again, fast is the optimal setting in my view. Some figures now, so with the normal response time setting, no overshoot, but some quite slow pixel responses, average initial time 10.67 milliseconds. Bumping up to fast, that improves the average initial time from 10.67 to 7.27 milliseconds, introduces a bit of overshoot, but not an extreme amount of overshoot. It's quite similar actually to 160 Hz in this respect, so you don't have to worry about extra overshoot at 120 Hz if you use, in my opinion, an optimal fast setting. And it's similar, by the way, if you're using VRR or observing a static 120 Hz refresh rate. Using the fastest setting, it introduces more overshoot, and I found this pretty eye-catching. Either way though, your average initial time has improved from 7.27 milliseconds to 5.8 milliseconds, but there are still some distinct weaknesses. So by all means have a play with the fastest setting. If some people may prefer that visually, but for me, again, fast is the sweet spot, and it's not a very sweet spot, but it's just my preference over fastest. I've now got the monitor running at 60 Hz, 60 frames a second for the content that's running at 60 Hz. To be honest, the overshoot, it's a little bit of an increase, so the sort of dirty trailing there is more noticeable. I did have some overshoot there before, now it's just more noticeable. It persists on the screen for longer, which is why it's more noticeable. But there's not like a huge amount of halo trailing or anything. It's not an obnoxious amount of extra overshoot. So I would still just stick with the fast setting as I am at the moment. The weaknesses in terms of the pixel responses are less pronounced now, but they're still there. There's still some smeary trailing in places. Probably able to see that on the video. Again, yes, it is less extreme because the pixel response requirements for good performance are decreased, but still some standout weaknesses. The sort of flickering effect is reduced, but still there as well. But as I'm talking about flickering, I do have to talk about VRR flickering. So yes, VRR works. It works well to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. It also does well to not have a huge amount of extra overshoot as the refresh rate decreases. So I guess you could say it's a single overdrive mode experience, although this experience isn't exactly fantastic in terms of the amazing fast pixel responses, because that's not what you're getting. But as a VA panel, it does suffer from VRR flickering. It can be difficult to show you in-game examples, so I'm just going to use the VRR flickering test for now. And this causes significant fluctuations in refresh rate, so the frame rate of the content, and therefore the refresh rate of the monitor is changing a lot in the VRR environment. You'll be able to see that on the screen there. Just under the resolution, it shows huge fluctuations, significant fluctuations. In game, you're not necessarily going to get this level of fluctuation, but you can actually notice VRR flickering. It's most intense when it crosses the LFC boundary, which it's doing a lot at the moment, which is what gives pretty intense flickering. And unlike OLEDs, it isn't just for the dark to medium dark shade, it's actually for the brighter shades, and actually for the brighter shades it tends to be more noticeable in this case, I find. So there's sort of intense full screen flickering when it does occur. If the frame rate is more stable, it doesn't occur in such an obvious way, but it can still appear in places even if the frame rate is quite stable. As far as VA models go, I'd say the flickering is not too bad, but if you're sensitive to it, you're sensitive to it, and it can be annoying. It can also occur in some loading screens and some in-game menus as well. So I've been playing a lot of Starfield recently. I notice it in the loading screens on Starfield, but it isn't just the loading screens. I mean, actually that's fairly stable, but you just might notice occasional flickering. I tend to notice that kind of flickering on loading screens a bit more on the OLEDs I've been using recently. But when I'm actually in-game, the flickering can be pretty intense. I don't know if this is going to come across on the video, but the problem is here again, it's sometimes crossing that LFC boundary. It's actually just above it a lot of the time, but sometimes it does flick above it. So I can see it on this wall really readily to my eyes. For some reason on the camera it's being filtered out a bit well, but to my eyes I can see it right across the screen at the moment, on the wooden beams as well. And I can see that the monitor is crossing its LFC boundary, and that's when the most intense flickering occurs. For some reason, again, the camera's filtering it out really well, which is kind of annoying when I'm trying to show it to you, but to the eye, this is a very distracting level of VRR flickering, again occurring when the LFC boundary is crossed. And just to stress, it's not only when the LFC boundary is crossed, but that's when it's most noticeable in this case. So I know I got a little bit sidetracked by VRR flickering, although it is important to mention, so I'm going to return to the 60Hz performance because I didn't quite finish off talking about that. So the pursuit photographs here show results at 60Hz. Again, some distinct weaknesses. The reference screen does perform a bit better, although it also has its own weaknesses. It's really mainly for the dark background, the top row, where the weaknesses occur. So with the normal response time setting, quite a bit of red on the graph, some slow responses, but not too bad for 60Hz, but not exactly wonderful either. Average initial time, 11.65 milliseconds. Using the fast setting, that improves to 7.91 milliseconds, but there's still quite a bit of red on the graph. But there's not a lot of overshoot, so it does well to handle the overshoot. With the fastest setting, the average initial time goes from 7.91 milliseconds to 6.8 milliseconds, and it does so without a huge amount of overshoot. That's sort of effective variable overdrive if you like, although again, it's still kind of slow in places, so not exactly the most incredible experience. But this just goes to show that you may prefer the fastest setting sometimes, but there are some ranges where that fastest setting is really going to have a lot more overshoot than is observed here. So yes, it might slow itself down a bit at 60Hz, but if you're closer to say 90Hz, you might notice some real overshoot spikes. I tended to sort of between 90 and 120 Hz. I noticed really quite strong overshoot with this fastest setting. So again, I just prefer fast, and neither setting is particularly fast. I'll just mention here as well, naturally you get the same kind of experience for 60 frames a second movie content as you do with games or just observing the monitor at 60 frames a second more generally, because that's what you're doing, or 60Hz. For low frame rate movie content, which is common on platforms such as Netflix, which runs at around 23 to 30 frames a second, the pixel response requirements for a decent performance are much lower, and there are still some weaknesses in places, but overall the weaknesses are much less apparent than at 60Hz, and certainly compared to high refresh rates. So I watched a lot of this sort of content on the monitor, and I didn't really feel the pixel responses were greatly hampering the experience. I should also mention as well, actually, I did game a lot on the monitor, and you'd think based on what I said that I really hated the gaming experience and found the monitor super slow, but I'm going to say actually I didn't play as badly as you'd think I might, considering this. Yes, I did notice the weaknesses, but I actually still performed okay. So I'm not saying with any of this that you can't use this monitor for gaming, and you may well quite enjoy it, but I do have to be critical as a reviewer, and I do have to point out the relative weaknesses, of which there are quite a few on this monitor. The monitor also has an MPRT strobe backlight setting. It's actually MPRT sync more specifically, so the sync means you can use it with VRR at the same time. It can be used at a refresh rate with the monitor set to 120Hz, 144Hz or 160Hz. Various settings are restricted, such as brightness and response time, and the brightness is locked around 130 nits using this setting. So a reasonable brightness, but not going to be bright enough for some and too bright for others. It's better to have control over this setting, but you don't with MPRT active. And with the sync element, it will go down to about 90 Hz, 90 frames a second. Below that, MPRT will deactivate and the screen will switch to its normal VRR operation. So if you're frequently passing the 90 Hz floor in either direction, then the constant activation and deactivation of MPRT is going to be quite annoying. You can see from the images here, it has the monitor running with its fast response time setting without MPRT at 120Hz and 160Hz, and a comparison is given with it using MPRT at 120Hz and 160Hz. There's a lot of fragmented repetition of the object, and that can be seen behind in this case. For the central region of the screen, which is shown here, it's largely due to weaknesses in pixel responses that cause this. Further up the screen, additional strobe crosstalk, which is a distinct repetition, can be seen in front of the object. And further down the screen, additional strobe crosstalk is observed behind the object. The central region of the screen is where your eyes will mainly focus if you're playing FPS games, but for other games such as strategy games, games with scrolling text further up the screen, combat flight sims, etc., you may be more frequently observing the top or bottom of the screen. Either way though, the distinct weaknesses in pixel responses prevent the setting from being as effective as it could be, even centrally. I mean, the main object does still have improved clarity and there's a definite overall reduction in perceived blur using the setting versus not using it. And I should note as well that these observations I'm giving here, they're actually broadly similar regardless of refresh rate, although the trailing is slightly less bold at lower refresh rates. So you can see at 120Hz, for example, it's a bit less bold than at 160Hz, but it's definitely still there. There are also additional colourful flashes or colours such as red, magenta and cyan that can be seen in places due to the KSF phosphors used for the backlight. You can see fringing behind and in front of some objects as well, which is very obvious in some instances. I personally am very sensitive to the KSF phosphor fringing and flickering, and I find it really distracting, and possibly worse and more distracting than the strobe crosstalk. I don't really like either of those things, so from my perspective it's a setting that some will find useful, but it's definitely not the cleanest or best performing strobe backlight setting. So to wrap up then, in terms of the styling of the monitor, well, I like to see the coated metal stand, not my favourite stand design with the penguin foot. I tend to prefer simpler, more compact stands. It just give a decent premium-ish feel to the monitor overall, not super premium or super high-end, but it isn't a super premium or super high-end monitor, so that's fine. It certainly doesn't feel cheap or flimsy in my opinion. Good ergonomic flexibility with the stand as well. The size and resolution combination is nice. The curve to the screen, I could kind of take it or leave it, to be honest. I don't really notice it a lot when I'm using the monitor. I've been using it for a few weeks now. Very used to the curve. Appears rather natural to me now. The contrast performance, I've got to say, was sort of my main disappointment with this monitor because it's a VA model and that's where it's supposed to be particularly strong. Now don't get me wrong, it was stronger than your typical IPS experience, but with the contrast sitting around 2000 to 1, it was significantly lower than I was expecting and significantly lower than I've seen on some VA models. And this could be partly because of my unit. My unit could have had some issues which was restricting the contrast a bit, but it wasn't anything to do with how I'd set the monitor up. It was definitely a weakness on the hardware side in my case. But either way, I wouldn't expect the inter-unit variation to be such that this monitor is ever going to have stellar contrast, or any units of this model will have amazing contrast. Perhaps some of them will get closer to 3000 to 1 at least, but I wouldn't expect much beyond that. There's also a bit of VA glow and a bit of clouding on my unit. That can vary between units, but I do typically see a bit of clouding on curved VA models towards the top and bottom. Also some gamma inconsistencies being a VA model, perceived gamma changes at different points of the screen. I didn't observe much black crush, and that's not just because of the panel itself, which does have pretty decent viewing angle performance and colour consistency as far as VAs go, but it's also because my unit's gamma was a bit on the low side, which does actually help offset black crush quite effectively. But even so, there was the gamma was even lower, perceived gamma was even lower peripherally compared to centrally. On the colour reproduction side, quite a generous gamut, but not super generous. A pretty vibrant look. Again, not as much of a washout or reduction in saturation peripherally because the VA panel performed pretty well in that respect, but still not as consistent as IPS models and certainly not as consistent as OLED monitors. And with the colour consistency issues in mind and also the colour gamut itself, I wouldn't generally recommend this monitor for colour critical work or colour accurate work, but it can be used for a bit of that on the side if you need to. The responsiveness of the monitor, that was another area where I was disappointed, but actually I was fully expecting to be, because I've used a lot of VA models and they're often quite disappointing in this respect. This monitor was not the slowest VA model by any means that I've tested, but it wasn't the fastest I've tested recently either. So it was a pretty mediocre performance in that respect, but you still got some benefits from the 160 Hz refresh rate, and it at least had pretty low input lag, which didn't hamper the feeling of that refresh rate. VRR also worked well, did its thing to get rid of tearing and stuttering, although I did notice a bit of VRR flickering. Again, that's kind of an expectation with VA panels, and this one wasn't too bad in that respect, except when it crossed the LFC boundary, there was rather a lot of that. It also has an MPRT setting, MPRT sync, so you can use that at the same time as VRR. It was an okay setting, although it was pretty artifacty and, in my opinion, not very clean performance, but it's still usable, and some people will like to use it, so it's a good option to have at least. The HDR performance of the monitor, not really much to say about that. Pretty uninspiring experience, not particularly bright, no local dimming. The contrast isn't exactly incredible anyway. The colour reproduction wasn't super well balanced, and I had to use the movie setting, which is a little bit unusual to actually get decent enough saturation level so it didn't appear super washed out. But then there was a bit of oversaturation. So yeah, I mean, it gave a different look to things. This certainly isn't a monitor which I'd buy for its HDR performance, and I wouldn't suspect many people will be spending a lot of time using HDR on this monitor. So overall, I have to say that the monitor was a bit disappointing for me based on my preferences and my expectations, but some people I think are going to quite like this, and it is nice to have an option in this segment which is really very affordable as a high refresh rate 32-inch or so 4K UHD option. The monitor retails for just over $400, but it can be different in different markets, of course. So it's definitely on the affordable side for the spec of monitor, and some people are going to like the overall experience it offers. Now, my general recommendation and what I would personally go for, I'd go for an IPS alternative to this. One of the cheaper options out there we recommend as one of the best gaming monitors. It's on a few different recommendations pages, including on the best gaming monitor section of the website. That would be the MSI MAG 322 UPF. So that is closer to $500, so it's a little bit more expensive, but still a really good price for what you get. And the reason I prefer that really is the IPS panel offers better color consistency as well as a more generous gamut, so it's just more vibrant in general. The responsiveness is significantly better. It doesn't have issues with VRR flickering. The contrast is weaker, although, as I mentioned, the monitor I'm reviewing here is not particularly strong in that respect for a VA panel. So sort of the gulf in contrast, or the difference in contrast, isn't as great as you might think. Still an edge, again, with this MSI, but the IPS alternative, again, I just think it offers a stronger experience in enough areas to warrant serious consideration as an alternative. So that's really all there is to the MSI MAG 321 CUP. Additional resources can be found in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.